From that point on, I stood my ground. And I could still remember doing a Crosby, Stills and Nash live album where, their guys comes in. I'm actually at the console, and they're bringing in a ton of this outboard shit. And I'm saying, you can do that back home.
Right.
You ain't going to do it here.
Yeah.
You just got to stand your ground. You start plugging all that shit in on a live remote, you're just asking for trouble.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Today's episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is sponsored by Roswell Pro Audio, maker of handcrafted microphones in California. Inspired design and impeccable attention to detail will help you capture a gorgeous vintage sound without the vintage price tag. Check out their beautiful line of microphones at roswellproaudio.com. You may already know that using true analog gear is one of the best ways to create a great record. Yet increasingly, we live in a digital world, recording and mixing inside the computer. So what if you could have the best of both worlds? Tegeler Audio Manufaktur is bridging the analog-digital divide by creating high-end analog gear like the Schwerkraftmaschine compressor and the Raumzeitmaschine reverb, whose knobs you can control remotely using a plug-in in your DAW. Or their many analog units like the Cream bus compressor with mastering EQ, or the Veritube recording channel that let you save your settings using a custom recall sheet plugin, offering a complete line of pro audio gear from compressors to EQs to reverbs and beyond. Now you can get a pro analog sound while benefiting from the power of digital. Let your DAW help you move your knobs so that your music can move you. Click the link in the show notes to learn more about Tegeler Audio Manufaktur. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is David Hewitt, father of Ryan Hewitt, also on the podcast, and a remote recording engineer with an incredible list of artist credits. David Hewitt's engineering career started at Bob Lifton's Regent Sound branch in Philadelphia in 1970, and he moved on to Roy Cicala's record plant in New York to work in the remote division, becoming director by 1974. Hewitt designed and built the legendary Black Truck in 1978 and formed Remote Recording Services in 79 for independent engineering projects and equipment rental, eventually buying the Black Truck from Record Plant New York to add to RSS's expanding capabilities. In 1990, it saw the construction of the Silver Truck, a ground-up custom tractor trailer, and in 2003, Hewitt sold the company, but remained as president and constructed a new digital facility, the White Truck. I love these color titles for everything, too. It's kind of like Reservoir Dogs, the movie or something.
They match my hair color.
Okay, right on.
It was black, and then it went silver, and then it went white.
Oh, that makes perfect sense now. 2009, you left the company to form Hewitt Remote Services Ltd. You're an 8-time TEC Award winner and member of the TEC Hall of Fame. Other accolades include the Gold and Platinum Records, Grammys, Emmys, and CAS Awards. His audio engineering career has spanned over 4 decades, working in such diverse fields as live CDs, DVDs, radio, television, film, and cinecasts. I love cinecasts. I remember the whole simulcast thing was such a cool. That was the point at which, as a consumer, as a listener, you got to be an engineer too, because you were trying to sync up, your component stereo system with the TV, get everything going at the same time. Credits run from Aretha to Zappa, Miles to MJQ, George Jones to Shania, MTV to Met Opera, Die Hard to Disney, and some that simply defy categories, which hopefully you'll tell us some stories about that too. It was a blast to hang with his son, Ryan Hewitt, on the podcast, and I'm thrilled to have you here, David, on the show as well. Rockstars, please welcome David Hewitt to Recording Studio Rockstars. David.
There you go.
You've been asked this before when a show starts, but are you ready to rock?
Oh, yeah. And from doing all those years of television, I'm used to hearing the producer and the director on the PL over in the corner. Okay, fade them up.
Fade them up. Fade them up. What's the PL?
Originally, that stood for private line, but in television and film, everybody has to talk to everybody. So there's immensely complicated these days PL systems that run all over the place. Lighting, director,
just
producer.
a communications network that nobody on the other end is going to hear, but everybody who's doing the production has to hear.
Well, you can assign it. It's gotten very complicated these days. Who wants to hear what, when, where, why, how, and me in the audio truck. All I want to hear is the director. Leave all that other shit. The director and my guy on stage.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was interviewing someone recently who mentioned terms like A1 and A2, which I learned, I guess they're in the audio world. They're similar to, like, I've seen video production where you have all these camera people that feed signals in. There's a control room, and then there's people operating switches. And then somebody stands in the back and says, like, ready, camera one, do that and everything. And I guess, does some of that world exist also for the audio as well? Is that what that's what I was learning about A1 and A2?
Well, that kind of goes back to broadcast television, and it's a lot of it has to do with the union structure of how those things goes. But the A1 is the mixer, and the A2s are the assistants. And they just kind of generically call all of the guys that are assisting A2s, stage guys, assistants in the control room.
Okay. Yeah, I've been on a TV set for a band performance before, and it was the first time I ever, reached to pick something up, and somebody stopped me and said, like, yeah, you're not allowed to carry that or move that from here to here because of union regulations. I was like,
it can get very nasty. It's eased up a little bit, but in the old days, we'd go into Madison Square Garden or Carnegie, and you literally cannot touch anything, and they'll throw you out if you do. We've had some big throwdowns over that.
We don't. This doesn't have to be a talk about union stuff, but I guess on the one hand, it's. Whoops! I just turned my phone back on. I was trying to turn it off. I guess on the one hand, it's kind of cool that people were taking what we do seriously enough to say that, like, you have to be protective about having a structure so that we kind of all have jobs and careers in this stuff in the long run. Tell us more about who you are, David. Tell us, like, how'd you get into this whole live recording thing? I mean, when you started out, you weren't in a remote truck to begin with, right? Did you start out in a studio atmosphere?
I did, and it's a story that's often repeated in this business. I had a career before this. I was in very much a sports car and road racing lunatic. My father was an Air Force pilot. We were stationed in Europe in the early 60s, which was another golden age of road racing. And I'd go up to the Nürburgring and Le Mans and all that kind of thing. Totally addicted.
Wow.
And by the time we got rotated back to the States, I had decided to do that as the career, and that's another long, involved story. I worked briefly for Roger Penske back when he had married his first Chevy agency, and
he's a figure from the automobile and
well,
racing.
Roger
world,
Penske, for anybody that is into racing, is probably the most successful man that ever existed. He was a terrific driver, race driver. But he figured out the business model. He's won more Indy 500s than his teams than anybody, but that didn't quite work out. But what did work out, and is often the story in this business, it's all about a girl,
right?
And for me, it was there were actually a couple that kind of introduced me to the whole folk music scene and a lot of the rock stuff in the 60s, back in the hippie days.
Yeah.
And
this wasn't the girl at the finish line who's helping you hold up the winning cup or anything.
No, this was getting into the music area of it, and I became involved with a wonderful woman who was a successful folk singer and writer and so on. And she took me around to some of the studios. One of them was at the time the brand new Regent Sound Studios in Philadelphia, which was the old Cameo Parkway studio. For the old guys will recognize that, Bobby Rydell, Chubby Checker, that kind of stuff.
Okay, cool.
So it was a vintage place.
And was Philadelphia, was it as serious about recording and making records as, New York, a couple hours away there?
Oh, yeah, it really was. That was Philadelphia's always been a hotbed for musicians, Coltrane, just endless musicians. But there was, when Cameo Parkway failed, Joe Tarsia, who was chief engineer, founded Sigma Sound in Philadelphia. And that's where all of that great R&B stuff and later on the disco stuff came from. They had a wonderful studio. Regent was kind of a distant second. And there were a number of smaller studios in Philly, but those were the two active ones.
So you went and you took a look at these studios, and that was like a first time you got to see what a studio looked like?
That was it. I had no idea. And it when I finally made that decision that that's what I wanted to do, I conned the chief engineer, the late Joel Fine, into letting me hang out. It's the way it used to be. And I was there for 3 months, gratis, just being the gopher.
Sweeping the floors and doing whatever.
And Bob Lifton finally agreed that I was worth $50 a week. And,
nice.
So we ran through a lot of that stuff. I'm trying to keep this short. But the studio was then bought by Anthony A. Martino, who, if anybody's familiar with Amco Transmissions, he owned that whole franchise.
Wow.
And he sold it and decided he was just going to have fun for a while. He bought the studio. And that worked great for a little while, but it started going downhill. I went out. We had to do a television pilot when Regent was still going strong. And we had already done a few things, where you're dragging the equipment out and setting it up. This was way too big, 26-piece orchestra.
Right.
I knew that Record Plant in New York, which was new at that time, they were only founded in '68. They had a remote truck, and I knew that because they had done the George Harrison's The Concert for Bangladesh.
Nice.
In what, 70?
Yeah.
Was that 1970?
Sounds about right.
So that was world famous, and of course George Harrison. So I knew they had the truck. Called him up. I got Chris Stone, the founder, on the phone magically. Told him what I had to do, and it was, yeah, absolutely. We'll send the truck down, and all the guys, no sweat. We'll take care of everything. Hangs up. That old truck comes down, which was actually a 1970 Wally Hyder truck. And we did
so
that.
This isn't the black truck yet.
Oh no.
Okay,
no,
we're getting that.
Much later. But we did this. These guys came down and just attacked that stage, got it all set up. Did the sound check. Did the show, and it was all just going like, military clockwork. These guys are really, really professional. And
that probably appealed to the race car driver in you, right? The element of efficiency.
It's very much like that. These guys had it all down, and it just seemed to go, so effortlessly and so quick. And I got back in the studio, the next day with tapes, and I'm going, wait a minute, you can go in, you can do the live show, and then you leave, and you don't have to come back in the studio and deal with the producer and 16,000 guitar overdubs and all. I said, I like that idea.
Well, the next morning in the studio, that's everybody's showing up with a hangover. At least you go do the live show and everybody's in the good times, right?
Yeah. Well, so much of the time in the live thing, you're just off down the road.
Yeah.
You take the tapes, do whatever you want. I'm off to my next gig.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty wild. I've had one experience in a live truck. It was a friend of mine. It was a truck from Mississippi, I think, something like that. And we went and recorded a gospel thing and pulled up with this truck outside. And then, panels open up and big snakes get attached to the side of the truck. And I just thought the whole experience was just really cool. But it was nerve-wracking. And I realized that communication, like if you feel, so I refer to our listeners as the rock stars. So if I'm speaking to them, that's what it is. But rock stars, if you ever feel like you're miles away from the other room with the drummer in it, when you're in the control room, just imagine what it's like to be, literally like hundreds of yards away through winding hallways or whatever to get from a truck parked outside of a venue inside to where the action's happening.
Or something like Madison Square Garden in New York, where the trucks have to park down below, and it's 5 stories up. It's 1,000-foot cable run.
Wow.
To get up to the stage.
So it's below parking and sub-basements and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's street level.
Street level, okay.
But the actual auditorium is up that high.
All right, you're not down there with the New York sewer rats or anything way down there.
Nah, lots of security. But after having gone out to, I was trying to get a record plant started in New York. They built the studios there. Chris and Gary went out to L.A., built L.A., sold New York, and then they were also building Sausalito, up by outside of San Francisco. That's where I wanted to go. And
really?
I actually drove out there and was trying to get a gig, and guys standing in line for 10 deep. There was nothing to do. I came back to New York, and I went to record plant in New York, trying to make some money, trying to get a gig. The guy that was running the truck at that time, Frank Hewitt, saw me coming down the hallway. He literally grabbed me by the shirt and said, "You're coming with me." He had no crew. The truck was heading out to a gig, and he didn't have enough assistants. They couldn't steal anymore from the studio. And I already knew the truck.
Oh, that's
and
great.
I knew the Ampex.
Just from that time they came down to Philadelphia?
Yeah. But they had MM1000s, the big old mastodons.
Oh, I remember the MM1000. I've got a friend here in Nashville with one of those. Those things it's like if 2 refrigerators had, married a washing machine.
Yep. Huge machines. So we had 2 of those in the truck, but we had also had one at Regent, so I knew how to run those.
So now let me ask you this, David. So this is my buddy Brian Carter, who's a big fan of tubes, analog, and he's got a beautiful MM1000. And it's like some of the cards are above the tape transport area.
8 up,
and everything.
8 below.
Yeah, exactly. And we were on. He had like old brochures that showed the system they had built for synchronizing these, where you had another machine that was just as big and looked like NASA, CRT tube display readouts, digital readouts, to synchronize all these machines. It's pretty incredible looking. Did you guys have to do that sort of thing, or were both machines just running wild next to each other for backup? Or maybe you're going to explain why you would need 2 machines to us anyway.
Well, you got to have the redundancy, and the reason that we used the MM1000s is they would handle 14-inch reels of tape.
Redundancy with the idea that if one tape machine doesn't record something, that's no excuse. You still have to capture it. So a second one, but there's also the redundancy of, isn't there that when one machine's getting ready to run out of tape, you start the other one ahead of time so that you have a continuous record across multiple reels, or was that less of a thing?
Well, it depended on somewhat on the client and the budget. What we preferred to do was we'd go in and we'd chase one machine about 5 minutes in and park it, and then you start both of them at the same time. So you've got 2 masters going. And when the first machine runs out, the second machine is still recording. So you change tape on that, punch
smart.
it up. So you've always got an overlap going, and but you never know. It's I'll give you a story that illustrates why. You might remember the band Blue Oyster Cult.
Oh yeah.
And they recorded their albums at
more cowbell.
Yes, please. They recorded their studio stuff at Record Plant in New York. But their live stuff, they had a deal with a long gone truck called Fedco, and which really pissed me off because I figured we deserved, to get that gig. So I happened to be in the studio when they had come back from the remote with the tapes, and they were mixing in Studio A, and I hear all this yelling and screaming and carrying on in there, and I went, I stuck my head in the session, and they had run, because they're cheapskates, one machine at a time, rather than having 2 machines running. And somehow the machine didn't go in to record. Whoever the assistant was, thought he hit the right button, and nobody noticed. 14-inch reels, that's an hour of music, and there was nothing on the tape. And they're freaking out, and I kind of gently suggested after that maybe they ought to hire us the next time.
That's great. Those are the opportunities when they come. The gentle suggestion is a positive and encouraging offer to, do something, go an extra mile for them next time. As I'm assuming that was it, as opposed to berating them for not having made the right choice.
Absolutely. But, the thing that kind of differentiated our operations all along, I come from a military family. I'm a veteran myself. I grew up with aviation and then race cars and then the remote trucks. But the thing that was always a common denominator is it's the mission.
Right.
You're mission oriented. You're there to do that. And, and your focus is totally on that and on the client. You're there for the client. Now, I was the engineer. In television, they call that the IOC, the engineer in charge. And I engineered a lot of that stuff, had my own clients and so on. But if if the artist is bringing in their own engineer, then we're there 100% to back him up and make sure everything works for them.
Yeah, totally.
And that's a big difference. There's a lot of times there's egos involved with the remote truck staff that think that they know best. And I've actually used other remote trucks where the guy would tell me how to EQ something, maybe, and then when I got up to run into stage and everything, I once came back and found this guy changing my EQ on the console because he thought he knew better, and that just about landed him on the floor.
That was one of the things that helped me land one of my early gigs was a guest producer came in to record a band that I knew, and there was certainly room for ego because I would have loved to, be doing stuff. But when he arrived, I just instinctively let him know that, welcomed him into this new studio and let him know that my job was for him to look really, really good.
Yep.
I just told him that, and I was like, anything you need, whatever, I'm here to just make you look really great. And he told me later that he really appreciated that and that it sort of helped the whole session flow for him. So just a reminder to us that so often, it's a service industry, and
Absolutely.
And we're, whether it's serving another engineer or serving the artist or the band. Well, that's very cool. So tell us a little bit more about, kind of getting the first, getting to the point of the black truck and getting that thing going.
Well, that truck was already obsolete. It was very small. It was an 18-foot box crammed full of stuff. The console was a 1965 Domidio, which sounded great. I mean, I absolutely love that console. But it was 24 inputs, and it was 8 buses. And even though Record Plant modified it gradually with the jukebox to make it all the way up to
and
24.
8 buses would imply that was supposed to be going to 8 tracks of an 8-track tape machine initially, right?
Yeah, that it was. And that was the only mixable stuff you had. Otherwise, you were patching directs. And that just wouldn't do, into the 70s. I remember we did an Emerson, Lake and Palmer gig fairly early on. And that's 3 guys. But they had 60 inputs, with all the keyboards and shit. In fact, there was a Dymo label on the front of house console that says it's only a 3-piece band, but try getting 60 inputs into that, dinky truck with a bunch of AM10 mixers and stuff. And it wasn't, you couldn't do that anymore. And I kept lobbying Record Plant to let me build a bigger truck. We're now doing television, film, the whole business is expanding. And finally, I convinced them that it wouldn't be wasting the money. That it's time for the change. And so I designed and had built the black truck, which was kind of the first real modern one. It was a great big Peterbilt. It had an acoustic design, had the big Westlake monitors.
Yeah.
We had Ampex 1200s. We had a custom 44 input API that thing, which still lives over at the House of Blues. I just saw
that's
it yesterday.
cool. Yeah, I think Ryan was mentioning that.
After
so is a truck design as a studio, is it designed to be soundproof from the outside to the in? Like, would you hear the speakers on the outside of the truck, or do you have to be protected from some other car driving by the truck, or is it a little bit more loose than that, where you just know you're going to park this in a safe zone when you're recording? What are some of the thoughts that go into designing a truck like that for a control room?
Well, you're very astute to ask that question, and it's both. In that truck, I actually had lead-lined walls in an effort to get mass in there, because I mean, you've got two things to fight. First of all is the air seal, because noise creeps under any leak that you've got air-wise. The sound is going to go one way or the other.
And it turns out that concerts tend to be fairly loud environments, don't they?
Yeah, you might say that. And so this thing had tremendously thick walls, and it was all spray foam on all. It was huge.
Yeah,
there were 6 inches of isolation on that, and to keep it from getting out too. We were doing a show in New York at the old God, now I've forgotten the name of that venue anymore. It originally had been an RCA recording studio for Elvis and so on, but it became kind of a punk rock club, and it's right down on 11th Street in the middle of a residential area.
Not CBGB's or something like that.
No, but it's down in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
And we've got the truck parked out on the sidewalk, and every time we would open the door during a sound check or something, the noise had come out, and there was a bunch of questionable women on an apartment about 3 floors up. And every time that we'd open that door and the music would blast, they would throw flower pots at us. So there's the other aspect of it.
Wow. New York in the 70s. I think my mom had a story about a flower pot, like falling off a window ledge when she was pregnant with me in New York. So I almost didn't make it from a flower pot myself.
Yeah.
Well, so very cool. So you designed and built this truck. Maybe talk a little bit about what the process is of pulling up to a venue and setting up for recording. I mean, I've got a lot of questions, but I think we might need to just we might need a little bit of a general education on what it means to do a truck-based live recording at a venue.
Well, the what we used to say, it's common road theme, is that the show is that little inconvenience between the load in and the load out, and it really is true. I mean, that's what we're there for, is to record that show. But that show is 2 hours long?
Yeah,
plus or minus. But all of the stuff that you have to go through to get there, and this is something for your audience that's just starting out.
The rock stars.
First, you got to advance this thing. You've got to talk to management. You got to talk to the producer. You got to try and find out, who's doing the PA. Contact the PA company. Try and talk to the, all the people that are involved. Hopefully, the front of house mixer. Then you've got to contact the venue so that they know you're coming, and they know that you need a parking space. You need this much power. You need yada yada yada. So you're doing all that before you even start the engine.
Yeah.
And then you've the get there, which for us was that truck ran the entire gamut. We've been to most of the states in the country, and in Canada and all over the place, and our fly packs went all over the world. Wow. But there's that. I mean, we're in New York, we're going out on Neil Young's Rust Never Sleeps tour, for instance, and you hit all the big cities all along the way, and end up out in San Francisco. And you've got to advance all that stuff. And of course, this is long before you could do any of that with a computer. It was all road maps.
Yeah, really.
What have you. And then you get there, and, the first thing is you got to park this monster, which is not as simple as it sounds. Everybody fights for those spaces. The standing joke is we're always going to park by the dumpster, because that's where nobody else wants to park, and it's close to the stage door. And then you got to get the power, and then you got to, you're dealing with the union guys, you're dealing with the PA company, mic splits, sound check, all that crazy shit.
So let me inject this question too. You said you've got to talk a little bit about the difference between how important it is for you to do those things so that you know that they're right and you've got them in your head, versus having a team where you trust that somebody else is getting those things right for you.
Well, if you've gotten to that point where you have a team, and we did eventually some of it, but I always had to make damn sure myself that stuff was taken care of, because sometimes it doesn't happen. And we had one episode, was it Joe Jackson?
Yeah, tell us an episode. We want to hear an episode story.
Yeah, it was one of back when there was a lot of live radio, you
Yeah.
know, which you're very familiar with. There was a series called the King Biscuit Flour Hour.
Oh, right. That truck is parked over in Douglas Corner, right here in Nashville.
You mean the MTV truck?
I don't know the details of it. So yeah, I was just told it has like a King Biscuit Flour Hour logo.
They may have that, but it nothing to do with that company.
Okay, all
back,
right, fair
back
enough.
But I used to fight with them tooth and nail to get information out of them, because oftentimes they didn't want to tell us. Oh, well, the deal isn't done yet. We don't want to spook them. Don't call them, you know. And I constantly fought that battle. And for one of those things that Joe Jackson, or one of the '80s Brit bands that was successful, was coming in, and we had initially been put on hold to do a gig in Pittsburgh, one of the Grand Ole Theaters. So we do all, you know, you book hotels, you book flights, you do all this shit. You know, the truck drives out, and I meet them. And we pull up to the venue, and we go in, talk to the guys, and they're all going, well, shit, nobody told us, you know, what's going on. Well, wait a minute, let me get a hold of the manager. And the tour manager was just coming in on a plane, so we're standing around, you know, watching the clock. They won't let us set up till they get the approval from the manager. And when he finally shows up, he walks in and he says, "Look, guys, I'm sorry, but you know, nobody knows anything about this. I just took up the management position. The other guy got fired."
Wonder why?
Yeah, you know, but it was also on the King Biscuit people, because we'd keep trying to get information out of them, and they were not forthcoming. So I couldn't verify calling anybody to find out. So the whole thing was a waste. But you're paying. King Biscuit, you're paying the freight. I don't care if you don't have a tape. It's your fault.
Yeah.
You know? So they never did that to me again.
Yeah.
That was the end of that.
Well, that's a tough position to be in. What advice do you have for the rock stars about when they find themselves in situations where they need to sort of stand firm on that? And do you have any advice as far as how you navigate that? How do you stand firm, but your goal is to continue doing more business together and have it go more smoothly? Do you just have any advice in general about, you know, the best ways to handle situations like that?
Well, that's an excellent question, because every one of those things is different. Every one of us have different negotiating things. I'm afraid that I had a pretty polite but hardcore standing on that, and that is that. You know, here's the budget. Right. We get 50% up front and 50% when you get the tapes.
Yeah. Did they call you the friendly sergeant or anything like that?
There was a couple of them that had some not polite names for it, but you know, but it was a business. We had to pay the bills. We had to do all that stuff. But more importantly, you had to retain the respect of the client. Yeah. And the PA companies and the management companies, they all had to know, you know, these are the pros. We were at the top of our game in those days. But we also don't take any shit. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let me jump forward. So let's say you're in a situation where they did expect you to be showing up. How do you go about sound checking a live recording gig to make sure that you're really capturing the best version of the recording? Is it just sort of knowing that things work, and then when the band goes, and I guess part of this question is, you know, are you doing a lot of live mixing, or is it multi-tracks to mix later? Maybe you want to talk about that whole process.
Another good question. The last first, it's always live, and you're nominally there. You're to record multi-track of the show so that they can take it back and remix it and re-edit and do all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that changed greatly going into the 70s is it was more and more live to air stuff, and award shows and television and all that kind of thing, where it really is going out over the air. So, so now you're doing both. You're doing a live mix in real time, and the The multitrack sometimes becomes just ancillary to what you're doing.
It's like an archive of what happened in case you need it, kind of thing.
So there's a lot of that kind of prep, and
that was just due to the fact that television was just booming and booming and booming, and so sound became became a support element for the television in a way, or not to describe it in the wrong way, but I mean, as opposed to maybe early on, it was like, hey, we're doing a live show, might as well put out a record to go with this kind of thing, right?
Yeah, back then, a lot of our live recording for the rock bands was a simple way to make a greatest hits album. And it was much less expensive than studio time. But when television came about, a great example was in 1974, Frank Sinatra had, when the Beatles invasion came, a lot of the old singers and the big bands kind of faded, and the rock was king. Sinatra hadn't had a record out in about 4 years, but he decided to make his comeback tour, with the big orchestra and all that kind of thing. So he went out on tour.
You got to record that.
We got to record that. And I got to tell you, growing up, my dad listened to that stuff, big band, Frank Sinatra and all that stuff. And I just sort of, it's dad's music. Happens today. Once I heard that Don Costa big band, with these jazz guys that had 100,000 hours of playing, and listened to Sinatra, it just blew me away.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. But the main thing that we were there to do is down at the end of the tour from Madison Square Garden was going to be one of the first of the big satellite shows, linked up with stereo radio stations across the country. And like you were saying earlier, you're at home trying to tune in your stereo radio and your
turn on the
television
TV
set
at the same time.
And this is all brand new. Everybody takes this stuff for granted now, but it
and rock stars, just to wrap your minds around this, if you don't picture it, is if you were going to listen to the music on the TV, a TV speaker was a little dinky thing back then on your TV, and simulcasting it over the stereo meant you could have it on the big stereo, have sort of a big sound while you're watching this on your TV screen.
Exactly. And that went on for a while from there. And you were always at the mercy of, in those days, and on that show as well, the way you got the audio up to 66th Street where ABC television was, phone lines. And that meant that we had to have adapter boxes, but there's phone lines in Madison Square Garden, and you patch that in there. And then down the street, there's some, telco building where another guy patches something. And God knows what this goes through before it gets up to ABC television. And we would have nightmares struggling with that stuff. And you're on a hardline telephone trying to verify all this stuff, which nobody can even conceive of that today. No cell phones, no nothing. And we actually had some live shows like that where some union guy would come on duty over at telco and look at the patch bay and say, "Oh, what's that? That must be leftover shit." And they unplug us.
Oh, man, right in the middle of a show or something.
But it evolved from there. And that's one of the reasons that I was able to build that black truck, was to convince record plants owners that we're doing more and more and more of this stuff. And we got to have the
ready
equipment.
for it. Yeah. It's all about preparation, right?
Preparation H, and but you got to have a big console. You got to have these bigger snakes, and all this stuff. It needed the whole new truck.
Okay, so what about the sound check portion of this? You show up at an event, you set all these things up. There's a part of connecting things that just says everything's working, but then there's also a part that where David, the creative set of ears, listens and goes, okay, this sounds good. So is there a stage in the sound check where you get to feeling comfortable that you're ready for the show to start and it's going to sound good?
Well, in the big time rock world, where you got back then Shoko and Clare Brothers were just growing into the monsters that they became. But all of that equipment was evolving as well. And in those days, it was all transformer isolation mic splitters, which slowed things down a little bit. But you had to go in and convince them to let you plug into their system and then plug into our splits, and then you go through and check everything out and make sure it's all
right. Let me take a moment and explain that to the rock stars too. So typically a microphone comes off the stage, somebody's singing into a mic, that goes into a mic snake and goes straight to the front of house console and goes to the speakers and the monitors. Yeah. And in this case, in order to record it, you say, hold on, we're going to put our box there first, and the mic is going to go into our box, and then it splits it through a transformer so that one of those goes out to the front of house and one of them comes to you at the recording truck. And my understanding of why that's useful is because it gives you a very clean signal to record, but it also isolates you from the front of house and prevents buzzes and hums, I guess, theoretically, right?
Exactly. Well, you also ground lift them, and the... And again, that's one of the things that evolved with the trucks.
And I guess that helps to answer a question I wanted to ask about, would you always use the same mic that was used in hitting the PA for the audience would be the mic that you'd be recording with? Or would you sometimes use additional mics just for the recording that were different from what the audience hears?
Well, typically, if it was a rock tour and you're intercepting these guys on the road, they've already got all this shit dialed in.
Would you be using the same mics that they were using and hitting the PA, or would you use additional mics of your own to try and capture it, something that was different from what the audience was hearing?
Well, once again, if you're doing the touring rock band where, you're intercepting a tour that's already dialed in, again, you're intercepting a rock tour that's already been out there, God knows how many dates, they got all this shit dialed in, especially the monitors and the vocals, because that's always right on the edge of feedback for those guys. So, first of all, again, you want to make sure that you've talked to those guys about the sound check, and we need it too, because it's the first time we're hearing this. We got to get levels and, and make nice, and so everybody's on the same page. And if you're lucky, you get a sound check. A lot of bands don't even do that, especially anymore.
Right. So they may not sound check themselves. They might just have their assistant go check the guitar and go, sounds good.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a roadie sound check.
Yeah.
But, what you're lobbying for, of course, is to get the real band out there and get real levels. After which they will turn up 10 dB when they hit the stage.
Totally good reminder. Set your levels exactly 10 dB lower than where you're gonna need them.
That's often the case. But to answer your question about the extra mics, again, you don't want to be changing stuff on these guys that have already got a difficult job mixing live shows. Sometimes we'll maybe augment mics. The usual culprit is maybe the drum overhead mics or cheesy something.
Right,
you want to put out a pair of 87s or something like that.
Yeah. So just a reminder too, to the rock stars, is that those drum overhead mics that work for the live sound, the live guy may be like, yeah, I just need a little bit because those cymbals are coming off the stage. I mean, if it's a huge place, you're only going to hear what's through the speakers. But, if it's some smaller venue, it's called sound reinforcement. It's not the same thing as recording. You're just trying to send additional stuff through the speakers. So hence you may need to use different mics to capture, a fuller picture for the recording, right?
And a kind of a classic example of that, we were doing The Who on
tell us about that. That's great.
Quadrophenia tour, which was 70.
And was Pete's amp nice and quiet and gentle?
Oh no, but for the additional mics, we're looking at the drum kit, and it's got shitty mics, 57s on the overhead. And and we're out there and we're about to put up a couple of 87 Neumanns, for overheads, and the monitor guy comes over and he says, you don't want to do that. What do you mean? We're thinking it's just going to be in the way. And he says, well, at the end of the show, Keith trashes his drums, and your mics, your expensive Neumanns, are going to get the shit kicked at them. And, and reluctantly we did. I think made some compromise of something cheaper. And the result, when they end up the show, Keith just walks through his drum kit, kicks the shit out of everything, knocks it all over the place, mic stands falling down. So
it's a good way to prevent having to do an encore.
Yeah, that's one way. Guitars are all smashed, drum kit's smashed.
You need to just sort of like rig up strings on your U87 so that like the moment that he does that, you just pull a lever and they just zip off out of the way,
Yeah, we wish. But
any other stories about recording The Who? What about just the sound of all that stuff? What about you and just your musical taste? What was the stuff I mean, you talked about recording Frank Sinatra, but what was the stuff that you got excited about the sound of? Did you find that you were almost always excited about the sound of what you were recording? Were there other times where you lean towards the craft of recording it, but the music doesn't turn you on,
Good question. And back to the old saw, there's only two kinds of music. There's good music and there's bad music. And the great thing about that whole remote business and one of the things that kept me going for so many years at that was the huge diversity. I mean, we got to do everything. And that first, I started to tell you about that first gig when I walked back into Record Plant in January of '73. And Frank grabs me, and on that truck, we drive up to Cleveland. And it's the first of this King Biscuit stuff. It was the Mahavishnu Orchestra with John McLaughlin, this insane fusion band, that had been with Miles and all that stuff, and just absolute incredible cacophony. And there was some rock band opening for him I'd never heard of called Aerosmith.
That's great.
And we finished that, wrapped the truck, immediately drive to Boston. Where we were going to record the Boston Pops, the Boston Orchestra.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I grew up in Boston, so it was all about the Boston Pops.
That, and the hall, the great symphony hall. Yeah. The RCA classical guys made us take everything out of the truck, console, machines, take it upstairs where they could actually see the orchestra down, and it was down on the floor as opposed to the stage. Recorded Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops.
That's right.
And in those days, I did a little bit of everything. And I was down there placing mics on the stage. And for the first time in my life, I'm walking around one of the world's great symphony orchestras, walking among these guys as they're playing.
Wow.
How unbelievable.
So this was, when you record an orchestra like that, was it also an audience in the hall? Or
no.
Was it, this is just strictly for recording at this point?
That one was, which is very rare. We did that. So we finished that up, jump in the truck, drive down to New York, and there's a famous club called Max's Kansas City downtown. And we were there to record this guy that was opening for a folk singer named Biff Rose, who I happen to like, but and his name was Bruce Springsteen.
That's great.
And he had just put out that first successful album of which he did at Record Plant, but still he was struggling. In his biography, autobiography, he describes that he used to commute by bus from his ramshackle home in New Jersey to do gigs like that because they didn't have any fucking money.
Right.
They hadn't sold any records. And here's Max's Kansas City that loved him. And that was like, I think the first live show that he did with the E Street Band, when they just linked up. And those two shows, that Mahavishnu and Bruce, and then one other show became the very first King Biscuit Flower Hour live radio show. And what those guys, and they became one of our best clients. They just recorded hundreds and hundreds of live shows.
Springsteen and the E Street Band. That's great. Those guys are so talented. I remember seeing the Super Bowl performance a few years back, and I couldn't.
That.
Oh, you did that? No shit, you did that one. Wow, that was great. I just thought it was remarkable the level of energy and performance and entertainment value of it. And how old is
he?
Bruce
Had just turned 60.
That's amazing.
And that guy, and there's another beautiful story for you, for us real audio guys. They had tried to get Bruce to do the halftime show forever. And when they finally talked him into it, they're getting down to the tech details. Yeah, we've got the latest big high def video truck, and they got a $900,000 digital console, and you'll be great in there. And Bruce says, "What? Nah, we can't do that. We got to have our own truck." Oh, but, and he says, "Well, that's what we're doing. You don't want me to give you, if you can't give me the right tools, then I'm not going to do it."
Yeah.
So he had us bring the big old silver truck with an analog everything.
Oh, that's great.
And to do it because he wouldn't accept anything else. And of course, you want the acoustic environment to be able to mix that stuff.
Yeah, totally.
If you're sitting in the audio booth in a TV truck, I don't give a damn how capable those digital consoles are 1,000 in, 1,000 out, you're still in like a restroom size control room with all the video guys right next door, carrying on, yelling and screaming because that's their job. And every time the door opens, you're hearing all of that crap. And then the air conditioning is loud, and they don't seal because they're expanding walls.
Meanwhile, you have to perform as well. And I think people forget that the what you're doing as an engineer, mixing is a performance too, to go along with the band. You have to be in the zone completely. Well, that's pretty cool. That's wild. Let's ask you this question. What advice do you have for the rock stars about capturing an audience in a live recording? What are some things that they need to know about making it exciting sounding?
Well, that's another great question that often gets overlooked. And you can go back when they started remixing a lot of the multitracks from all those King Biscuit Flower Hours. Those engineers were very happy to have my stereo audience mix on the bottom tracks, because that's what makes it live. You're close mic and all this rock stuff, and you can hear the audience out there kind of roaring. But if you don't have that thing mic'd in two separate ways, there's ambience miking, in which you want to have the sound of the hall, even if it's bad. And then there's the direct applause stuff. So we used to do it in 2 layers. And back when I would have at least 2 stage guys, because one of those guys had to go up, depending on the size of the venue, maybe off of the balcony, or in Madison Square Garden, you're going up in the catwalks and dropping off hundreds of feet of cable to get those microphones far enough away from the stage that the delay isn't too bad, but down right on the audience, fairly close, third back. So
let me ask a dumb question. How do you attach a microphone to a cable that's going to dangle hundreds of feet down and be above an audience member's head and know that mic's not going to fall off there and knock somebody out?
Gaffer tape.
Gaffer tape is the trick. All right.
Gaffer tape solves every problem. But it's often fraught with, now these stories could go on forever. We were doing one in the big sports arena down in Washington, D.C., and we were doing an R&B act, which eludes me at the moment.
It's all right. You're off the hook for remembering all these things. You've done, like, just the list I'm holding of your, quote, short credit list, which Rockstars I'm going to include in the show notes. So just make sure you go to rsrockstars.com, use the magnifying glass, search for Dave, and you'll see it there. But just an amazing list. And I'm assuming that these are all the ones that you really approved of as well. So it's a pretty great list of credits.
Yeah, it was. And again, that was one of the things that really kept me going, is we got to do so many of these things, because unlike the studio, you're going to record Pink Floyd or whatever, and which means you're going to spend the next couple of years in a studio, working over this stuff endlessly. For us, we go in, we do the job, and maybe it's a long tour, Neil Young or somebody that really cares about getting all the performances, but for the most part, a couple of dates, wham bam, and then you're out of there and on to the next one. So consequently, over the course of my career, I got to record thousands of shows, and all of these different artists and all these different venues. And, and that really keeps you on your toes.
Yeah. I guess my version of something sort of similar is when I go to Bonnaroo and do the Hay Bale studio, and I record, exactly. And we'll have a band every hour come in and set up, sound check is 10 minutes. I say, what's the name of the first song? They start playing it. I'm already mixing it while they play it. Yep. And which reminds me to ask you this comment. Are you familiar with that, where, the first verse of the first song is out of balance, and then it finds the balance through that mix,
Well, hopefully, but yeah. The number one lesson for your listeners on that, the first thing is gain structure, because you can't mix those faders unless you're dialed in with the gain structure for every one of those instruments. And over time, you get to know where your particular console, where that preamp pot is, right, and that kind of stuff. So,
and really, Rockstar's reminder, gain structure, because people ask me about that sometimes. It sounds like a fancy term, and it essentially in your world just means like getting the levels about right. Right.
Well, it's in the stages too, because it's the first thing it hits is the preamp.
Right.
It's got to be, properly done there. And then if you're submixing it into, like the drums, then it's got to hit those buses at a certain level. And then you've got, and then whatever effects you're sending and whatever your monitor mix position is. And, that's right there, that's 3 or 4 stages that you got to have dialed up and correct.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah. And you got to do it right now. You got to learn to work very quickly. There's another famous example, and I won't give out names, but we got the Stones tour in 1981 when Bob Clearmountain was doing them in the studios, and we worked with Bob a lot. So we were able to pick up the 81 tour, whereas before it had been another truck with Eddie Kramer. And we did every one of their American tours all the way up until that when they came out for their 50th birthday. There was one year where the Stones did the Super Bowl halftime, and I don't know, 20 years ago maybe now. And and by that point Ed Cherney was doing their studio work.
Oh, cool.
So this is another great source for us, is that we would then, here's Ed. Ed's our friend, and we know him, and he loves the truck, and now we're backing him to do all this stuff. And they said, well, we've got a free truck out there, and it was the Westwood One truck, which is a fine truck. Biff Dawes, great guys, great stuff. And they're going to throw it in for the rights to the radio stuff. And Ed is saying, well, look, guys, if you don't want to do it the way I need to do it, then, just maybe get somebody else to do it. So they did. And they brought in someone who's, I won't name, big time studio mixer. And when the show went up, myself and other people started getting some phone calls from guys saying, are you guys doing that Stones live broadcast? No, we're not. And he says, good, and they'd hang up. Studio guy that wants to spend all his time on getting the snare sound right while the band is playing everything else. And here comes the solo here and the camera's on it, but you don't hear it.
Yeah, right.
In television, you're mixing to that picture.
The image, you're matching what you see.
It's the old film saw of see a dog, hear a dog. And you better have that fader up when he goes over to Keith, taking 8 bars over here. And this gentleman, who's a absolutely excellent studio engineer, couldn't help himself. He had to spend all that time getting things EQ'd
mixing
exactly
it
right.
the same way that you would be hearing the record or wanting to hear it as a record or something.
Well, he wasn't paying attention to the live mix.
Yeah,
because he was too busy playing with the toys.
Yeah. Well, so what are some things that you rely on for cues to do that properly? Do you have a video feed of what's being switched? Do you have notes in front of you so you know exactly what the arrangement is? When somebody's taking a solo and therefore you're prepared for it?
Again, great questions. And the answer is both. We always had, even if there was no television, we always had 2 of our own cameras out there. Typically you want a wide shot so you can see the whole band, and then you maybe do a spot mic on stage left or stage right to get a perspective of who's stepping up to that vocal mic.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But wherever possible, and this is one for your audience, that goes right back into the pre-prep. If they adhere to a set list, that's great. Let me have it. Try and get cues from the front of house guy or the monitor guy, and have those cues ready so that because those solos don't always come where you would think, and maybe we forgot to tell you about the 3 guest singers. That are gonna, so you do every possible thing you can to prepare yourself for that live mix.
And simplify, right? So for me at the Bonnaroo studio, one of the things that we learned was, because we're using the same inputs for different instruments, we no longer call things by numbers. We call things by, kick in, kick out, or, like percussion mic or whatever. And if it's a trumpet coming down acoustic A, DI, that's what we're calling it.
Yeah.
And it just makes that a lot easier. You don't have to do math in your head. Another thing was learning that what I'm seeing, anything that was going to be panned to the left, it's kind of the dog, see a dog, hear a dog. It's like, I want things arranged so that the thing that's on the left, if I hear it, if I see it, I just go for it on that fader that's on the left, and it's going to match, because when you start crisscrossing things, oh man, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. And that goes right into the thing. And again, there's studio engineers, live engineers, and again, going back to film and video, it's, we refer to it as camera left, camera right. Or if you're on stage, it reverses, and it's stage left and stage right. And it's amazing how that confuses people that aren't used to it. And it's just one of those simple brain twists that go, I don't know. What do you mean, stage left? What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, one of the tricks we do here in the studio is with the drum set, for example, we never call anything left and right. I just call it hi-hat and ride. Yeah. So that determines which, room mic. You make sure the room mics are matched up to the overheads or whatever.
And that was another thing in the beginning days, pre-MTV, when it started to become necessary. A lot of engineers did the drums from the drummer's perspective. And how many of those rock records that you listen to of the old guys will have that? Yeah. And I did too. I always liked that. I always liked
Me too. In the studio, I'll do that. But when we're at Bonnaroo, I flip it.
You got to, because everything's about video these days, and it has to be camera view.
Yes. Well, very cool. Well, David, let's take a break for a second. We'll come back in for more questions in the jam session. Really love having you here in the studio with us. Excited to be talking about all this stuff. Rockstars, a reminder, if you want to find more info about this, I put together a wonderful YouTube playlist. David has lots of videos where he's talking about this stuff in various places. So I put those together into a YouTube playlist. Just go to the show notes on your mobile device, or go over to rsrockstars.com and use the magnifying glass, search for David Hewitt, and it'll take you right to the blog post. We'll see you guys in a moment for the jam session. Roswell Pro Audio brings you microphone design that is out of this world. Endorsed by a growing list of artists and producers like Phil Collen of Def Leppard, Ross Hogarth, who's recorded Van Halen, Ziggy Marley, and the Doobie Brothers, and Super Dupes, working with Drake, Mary J. Blige, and Eminem. These are all rock stars that have discovered just how great Roswell microphones sound. Check out the Mini K47, which uses a capsule modeled on the one in the vintage U47 at a street price of only $299, or the beautiful Delphos condenser microphone with a capsule tuned like the vintage U67 with great clarity and far lower noise at a street price of only $899. In fact, you are hearing my voice right now on the beautiful Delphos microphone. These mics are carefully crafted by hand and immediately feel good even before you plug them in and hear how great they sound. These are well-built microphones that will last you and your studio a lifetime of great recording. Check out more audio examples of these awesome mics at roswellproaudio.com. Hey Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest again today is David Hewitt, talking about live recording with a remote truck. Many, many amazing artists that you've worked with. David, you ready to jam?
Sure.
All right, let's do it. So one of the artists that I know you have worked with, among many others, is Frank Zappa. I wondered if you had any stories to share about recording his stuff. There's so many I want to ask you, but let's just start with that. I was always a big Zappa fan. In fact, I used to have nightmares that in my nightmare, had a chance to audition for Zappa's band, and I'm sitting there playing guitar, except that I broke my high E string and I couldn't figure out what to do to fix it in the middle of an audition.
Boy, oh boy. Well, listen, I got a bunch of those stories, but one of them that I always get such a chuckle out of is a man named Davey Moore, who kind of showed up at New York record plant when I was there. He worked with us a little bit. And then he went to L.A., looking for a better opportunity. And Chris had put him in charge of the tape copies. That was something you used to do back in those days as you become an apprentice. Tape library and cassette tapes and all that, tape copies. In record plant in L.A., there's a couple of hallways that intersect at 90 degrees. And Davey had just finished up some stuff, and he's walking down the hallway with his tapes and stuff, and he's whistling. Well, coming down the other blind 90-degree things, here comes Frank Zappa. And as he gets around the corner, he basically, he grabs Davy by the thing, and he said, "You're whistling my song. How did you get that? How did you get that?" And Davy's shaking in his boots, and he said, we were making a copy for you, and it just kind of stuck in my head. And he says, "You have absolute pitch, and you had that song down flow. You're coming with me." Takes him in to the studio and parks him, on a seat somewhere, and says, "Stay there, stay, dog." And at some point, the assistant on that date went off. Frank brings Davey in, so now he's in the sitting with the engineer beside the console, listening to all this great Frank shit. And then one day, the engineer disappears for whatever reason. Maybe he had another commitment. Maybe Frank fired him. He grabs Davey and puts him in the engineer chair. Just like that, all of a sudden, boom, there's his career. But it doesn't even end there. He decides he's going to take Davey out on the road and have him mix front of house. The poor guy has never done that. So Frank, in the first little while, Davey's told me these stories himself. He's out there doing, I think they were in Germany, and he's doing some stuff, and Frank's on stage. The show, not the sound check, the show. And Frank gets on the mic and he says, "Well, listen, y'all, I want you to meet Davey Moore. He's my new guy out here mixing front of house. And don't be alarmed if I get up and walk down there and give him some advice on how to do it." So the band's vamping away, and Frank goes down and he gets with Davey and gives him some cues and adjusts a few things, and then goes back on. And Davey stayed with him for years.
That's great. What was Davey's last name?
Davey Moore.
Davey Moore. Okay, cool.
Moia.
He sounds like somebody I need to talk to.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
And what era was this? What decade was all this happening?
Oh, that would have been early 70s.
Early 70s. Yeah. Okay, great. So very cool.
We worked with Frank off and on. He used to do an annual Halloween show in New York at the old Academy of Music. And we got to do a couple of those right up until he bought the Beach Boys had a little remote truck. They had like maybe a 30-foot trailer. It wasn't very big, but they had a beautiful old Neve in there, an 8028.
That was my internship.
Oh, was it?
Right here in Woodland, in East Nashville, at Woodland Studios, we had the 8068 in Studio A, and that was the first console I ever got to put my hands on.
Classic.
And I remember Bob Solomon, who owned Woodland, told me that had been Frank Zappa's live recording truck. Before that it was Beach Boys.
Yeah, boy. And they, of course, that knocked us out of the box, which I was annoyed with, and Mark Pinsky, who was doing his stuff at that point. But I get this call over at Record Plant the next year, and it's, "We're having a little problem with our 1200. Can you give us a hand?" So I had to rub it in. I had to go down and give him a bunch of shit. But it was all good fun. And
that's great. So would you have? So you did record a bunch of Zappa concerts. Things that I'm familiar with hearing, things live recordings, Baby Snakes, all these kind of things. Were those some of the stuff you would have done, or were you recording any tours around the album Apostrophe?
Well, the thing with Frank is that a lot of the live stuff that he recorded and we recorded, he would go through, and if he liked the feel of the band, he would then take that track and strip it and start overdubbing shit on it. Because that's the way he worked.
Yeah, Joe Ciccarelli talked about that for Chic Your Booty. He described taking the live recordings and then overdubbing to them in the studio.
So you never knew. And there was one tour, I can't remember what year it was, where we did two shows in Philadelphia. We did the big Spectrum and then the smaller Tower Theater. And the Tower Theater stuff was really good. We later on, I found that Frank had disseminated all those tracks and they were all gone. But after he passed, God, now I've forgotten his wife's name.
I think you were saying that you were recording when Frank was also touring with Dweezil. Right? That's
another story. That was the towards the end for Frank. He's basically dying of cancer, and but he was going to fly. They were doing his final show in New York as a tribute, and unfortunately, he was so ill by that point he couldn't fly out, and Dweezil had to get up and announce to the crowd who thought he was coming. But one of the beautiful things about this is, Frank was classically trained in so many ways.
Yeah.
Wrote all kinds of great orchestral stuff and really appreciated it. He had a gentleman who was a classical composer and conductor that, did all of that stuff for Frank, all those recordings in Germany and the orchestral stuff, Yellow Shark, all that kind of thing. This man did for him. And what he had prepared for this show was Eric Satie, the classical French wacko, one of my all-time favorites. I love Satie. And he wrote his one and only kind of an opera, and it was called Socrate, which is Socrates. And it was a chamber orchestra and a soprano and a tenor singer. And Dweezil had to get up. Here's the whole Frank band, all the original guys on stage. And here's the audience, with all the Zappa wackos out there. And Dweezil had to get up and say, now listen up. Frank wants you to listen to this Eric Satie piece. And he gives him a little history. And I don't want to hear any booze or cacophony or we want Frank, all that stuff. Frank wants you to listen to this and shut the fuck up. So they did, and we got the chamber orchestra on the floor, and they had recreated the original Calder sets for the film. This was done as a film in 1923 or something in Paris, and it was just heartbreakingly beautiful stuff. I'm just melting. And they're almost through it. And some poor kid in the balcony just couldn't do it. He couldn't take it anymore. And you hear this, oh, we want Frank. And he's on the verge of tears, And somebody smacks him because the rest of the audience was so tuned into the stuff. But it was perfect. Now, I don't know if that ever survived. They made a record.
Sort of made it out of the recording.
Yeah, well, it was a whole separate thing. And they did make a record of the concert. Horrible mix. But,
well, I definitely appreciated Frank's, deconstructivism in music and classical composition, everything. And, I'm somebody who loved Jazz from Hell when it came out. Another band that you worked with that I have to say, I guess, depending on your definition of it, you could probably, since I saw 5 Grateful Dead shows, you could probably call me a deadhead too. The Grateful Dead. Do you have any stories about recording those guys? Was it a different experience? You're parking a truck and what happens outside the venue is about as important, if not more important than what happens inside the venue at a Grateful Dead show.
Well, there's I have very mixed feelings about that band. But in 1973, there was one of the biggest rock concerts that nobody remembers. It was done at Watkins Glen, the racetrack, which I used to go to in my sports car racing days. 600,000 people showed up for that, and which was a record at the time. We were there to record the Allman Brothers, who were the headliner, and then it was the Dead, and then the band, and so all the guys from Capricorn Studios are there, and their engineer and their tech guy and all that shit, all crammed into this dinky little white truck, and we're dealing with all this crazy Dolby shit, and but anyway, they had made the offer to the Dead. There was the woman that was one of their designated engineers. I can't remember her name. She's a wonderful woman.
It'll come to us later.
And they approached her and said, "Look, if we've got enough tape. If you would like us to record the Dead, we'd glad to do it. Just gratis. As a favor to you guys." And she goes, great. But it just kept going nowhere. And we're getting down to the wire, on show day.
You mean musically it kept going over, like as in the way they just will play on and go off into space and all that? Is that what you're referring to?
No, just the decision.
Oh, the decision.
You want to do it, and we're show day, and I think the band was already on. And she comes down and says, "Okay," they said, "we can do it," and I immediately, talking to my stage guy, "Okay, get out there. We got to get the splits," because it was like a different subsystem for their PA stuff.
Wow.
And our guy, goes up and starts to go do that. Hell's Angels are doing security.
Oh,
And,
wow, man.
and a couple of these beefy guys, just kind of stop him right there. And the guy says, well, the band says, you ain't gonna say that, and they threw him off stage. He tried every angle, from stage left, stage right, and the whole, they wouldn't let him on.
That's hilarious,
and the poor woman is just tearing her hair out, but then they're on, so it's too late.
Yeah.
Can't do it.
What a trip. So, I think when you're making records as an engineer, there's an attitude of like, the workaround. It's like, you never let the tech give you no for an answer. You always have to find a way and work around it and do anything you possibly can to get it, unless it literally is like trying to force your way through a Hell's Angel that's just going to like take you out.
Yeah.
Then maybe that's the limit where you're like, all right, I'm going to let this one go right there. What a trip. Yeah. So any comments on the atmosphere and environment of a live concert back then versus what it is today? I mean, do you just have any, it seems like it was a little more of the Wild West at that point too.
Oh boy. Well, on that same gig, this stuff is going on, and, our little old white truck, and it was so, packed full of people and all this stuff, and it's getting hot. It's in the summer. We would crank open the big swing doors on the back of the truck, and we're parked right below stage left, and the stage is like 20 feet up, and we're right there. And of course, there's a big pile of plastic garbage bag that's been accumulating for forever. And I'm about to go contribute with our bag of stuff. And I'm opening the door, and I look up, to look around, see who, you're not going to bump into anybody. Here comes this hippie girl walking towards the edge of the stage. There was no rail, no handrail on that portion of it. And I'm going, oh shit. And she walks right off the stage, falls 20 feet into this bunch of plastic garbage bags, which totally cushioned her fall. And I jump off, and I'm going to go, see what she's broken. She is still standing up, and she gets off she's so stoned. She's just off in her own world and babbling stuff and seeing God knows what, and just walks right off, totally ignored me. And I'm going, okay, don't take the brown acid.
Wow.
And that pretty much defined it. You've got 600,000 people out there, and they're all stoned.
Yeah. Well, so that was a question I wanted to ask you, just sort of life, work, family balance. You managed to be on the road doing these shows every show is potentially a massive party. How did you navigate that for a career? And to the level that you feel comfortable to answering this, like, what extent do you feel like this is a world that you can participate in with a balance against, you got to do this again tomorrow. You've got a family to support, all those sort of things.
Again, great question. And I did. I had, in the end, I had 3 kids, and fortunately, my now ex-wife had worked in the business before. She'd worked for Elektra Records and Eddie Kramer and a bunch of things before I met. So she knew the drill. She knew what she was getting into and supported us. But again, my upbringing, military upbringing and racing and all of that kind of thing. Again, I'm just totally mission oriented, and there's no time for that stuff. And my career probably, as an independent engineer and maybe producer and that sort of thing would have been better served had I gone to those parties and done.
Because that's where the social networking happens, exactly. Right?
But I had a truck to wrap, and I as the commander of the truck, I can't leave these guys to do all the work, especially on the interior of all of my stuff, all of my, outboard and tapes. So I did not. And I passed, I can't tell you the number of things that I passed up. Yeah. But again, that's another lesson. It's not, those were wild days when nobody really knew the consequences of their excesses. And it's really not like that anymore. But that is a valuable point to your up and coming engineers, is you got to maintain control. You never want to get out in front of the party with the drinking or the drugs or any of that stuff. You always want to hold back.
Yeah.
And keep your sanity, because if you've ever and believe me, I did them all. But there was one point where I remember being in a meeting, and this was more for a film production meeting where there's a lot of people, but it was late in the afternoon and everybody's drinking. We were meeting at a restaurant somewhere, and I was holding back. I had to drive home or something like that, and I gradually became aware of like the Billy Joel lyric, "Businessmen getting stoned," and the deals are going, and there's all this stuff going on, and I'm realizing there's a couple of the management types that are faking their drinks because they're staying sober while they're negotiating with the drunk guy.
Interesting.
All right. Big difference.
Yeah.
Big difference.
Yeah.
You know? So keep that in mind.
Well, I know for me, one of the first times I was in the studio, I had come from being in the bands with my friends, and I was actually recording with friends and doing their record. And I was trying to keep up with the beer and the smoking pot or whatever was going on. And a couple of things happened. One is the first time I joined everybody and got a little stoned. And then I took a look at the patch bay with all the wires going out everywhere. I was like, oh shit. I have no idea how to do this right now. And then the other was that if I let even have 2 beers or something like that, something really changes with my ears and the speaker volume starts going up, and I was waking up with just tinnitus noise the next morning, and that scared the crap out of me, and I just didn't want to do it. So then I just sort of adopted an attitude that just says from beginning of workday to end, or at least until depends on what is going on. The tail end there, I'm not doing anything. It's not until afterwards that I'm, relaxing with a beer or something like that.
That's plus, the way to do it.
Plus, if you're doing studio stuff, maybe even the live stuff, at that very end, that's when you got to make sure that the invoice is getting paid and all that kind of stuff. You get to be most on, because otherwise you just don't get paid.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there is that too.
Yeah.
And I'm just as guilty as all of them. But I learned very early on, all the way back to Regent in the early 70s, that I couldn't mix and smoke dope. Yeah. Because it's just, you're sitting there going, oh, well, the console's on fire. Great. Isn't that interesting? It just.
Okay, actually, let's ask that question. So, you came up in a time where there was a lot of, a recording studio is like a game of mousetrap. It's like one of those Rube Goldberg prints. And everything has to click and fall and, do all these things just right for it to work. A little different from now, where it's like, as long as there's power to the computer and it turns on and the software doesn't, have a bug in it, there's a lot going that you can rely on. What was it like? I mean, did you pretty much have to assume that when you get going on something that part of the procedure is that there will be stuff that's wrong that you're going to have to solve every single time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, there's endless, because it's all mechanical. All those switches. And there's a Frank Zappa lyric out of one of his songs where he sings through a vocoder voice is wires, tires, pliers. I wish I could remember what song that is. But it's true, when you're constantly fixing stuff. And my best story for that is when we were building the black truck for Record Plant. And like all of those things, you keep pushing the envelope, trying to get it done to make a date. And in this case, we were in the middle of making a live album for a band called Kansas, who was very big at the time. Great band.
Now they're just dust in the wind.
Yeah.
No, I was just kidding.
Yeah. Or we called it rust in the bins. But we're heading out, and the truck is just barely finished. The paint isn't even dry and half of the stuff done. And it was a great big Peterbilt 352, 900 cube Cummins diesel on the 13 speed. None of us could drive it. I tried, and I've driven a lot of stuff, but I couldn't. I didn't feel safe trying to handle that. We found this crazy guy who drove for the circuses, perfect for the music business. And we all pile in the truck, and we're going to drive overnight to Pine Knob above Detroit, which was one of the big rock venues back in the day, out in the trees. It's about 3:00 in the morning. I'm asleep in the sleeper of the Peterbilt, and all of a sudden I hear this grrr, And being a longtime mechanic, I knew he just blew the engine, shut it off, and he shuts it off. We coast. We're out in the middle of nowhere. It's 3:00 in the morning. We had passed one of those roadside phone booths, way pre-cell phone.
Right.
And I go running back there with my Peterbilt book of dealers. It's Sunday, everybody. It's 3:00 in the morning. Nobody's answering. I finally, ironically, I get a guy here in Nashville number, call him up. He's, 24-hour thing. I explain the problem. He finds a tow truck out of Detroit, giant semi, tow truck. They finally come down. They tow us to the venue, park us in the back. So we've made it in time for the show. And fortunately, they had sold out shows for the better part of a week.
Oh, so you could leave it parked there and work while you get it repaired.
Yep. And I call up the nearest Cummins engine warranty guy, and they come down and they rebuild the engine in the truck while we're recording.
Wow. And
they just made it as we finished our engagement there, and we fired it up. And I'm sweating bullets because, God knows, did shrapnel get into the oil? Is it good? Am I going to blow this thing again? It went on for hundreds of thousands of miles after that.
That's great.
But we just picked up the tour again and made an album which went way platinum a number of times.
Way platinum. I love it. It's like that scene in Spinal Tap where he's like, oh, I don't know, we're playing at the Enormo Dome. Spinal Tap, did you record those guys? Were they on tour when you were doing your thing?
Well, we, like often happens, we would catch up with some of the members, and there was a film being done by Paul Schrader, who was a very famous director, just passed away, I think. And it was kind of his life story about growing up poor and rock bands and all that stuff. And he had Joan Jett starring and Michael J. Fox, and they had this band they'd put together, and it was, God, who was the bass player in Spinal Tap?
Nigel Tufnell playing guitar.
But the real actor's name I can't remember. But he was an actor, and so he's in this film and doing this stuff. And we're, films often take all kinds of time to do shit. So we're all hanging out in the hotel, and there was like a party room or something upstairs, and we're all just hanging out, and the jokes are flying, because everybody on this thing is just hysterical, including Michael J. Fox. This drummer is so young. I mean, this guy is 17, 19, whatever, but a phenomenal talent. And somebody made a reference to Ozzie and Harriet, which is an old 50s television sitcom that none of your young people will have a slightest idea. All of us old guys did. And the kid kind of, like an anxious puppy, wants to get in on the conversation. And he just kind of pipes up and says, well, I know who Ozzie is, but who the fuck is Harriet? And there's a pause, and then the whole room just erupts because, of course, he's talking about Ozzy Osbourne.
Right.
And the poor kid is so embarrassed because he doesn't know.
He doesn't even know what's going on. That's so funny.
But
that's great. Another couple of great engineers that you worked with, or at least I had seen that in your videos, Tom Dowd and Elliot Scheiner.
Oh boy.
What were some things you learned from those guys, and what was the capacity in which you worked with them?
Well, Tom, of course, was, in on the ground floor of all that Atlantic Records stuff as a producer. He's the guy that custom built their original 8-track, along with Les Paul. They were the first guys to do that. He had been involved in the Manhattan Project in Manhattan. He's a nuclear engineer. He's the guy is just such a polymath. It's just off the map. And so I'd run into him. I went up to visit a number of times. Hall and Oates were from Philadelphia. I used to work with those guys back when they were still struggling and living there. And I went up to see him when Arif Mardin produced their album. And Tom was engineering a bunch of that along with Gene Paul, who's one of Les Paul's sons.
Okay, cool.
And he still survives. He's the last standing Paul. But where we really got to spend some time with him is when the Allman Brothers went back and redid their live album, which we did in Boston and New York and a bunch of those different things. And, he'd long been a producer by that point, so he didn't engineer anymore. But again, the things that most important things that you learn out of people like that is grace and control. The man would he was just unbelievable, the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet, and just very calm and collected, and yet in control. He just had that. Of course, even by then he was in his 70s, but it was all about that and how he would produce the band. And there's another guy that he should have been a multi-millionaire with all of the things that he actually produced. And
For
he
Tom Dowd, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was a modest guy, and he would often, he would end up producing an album like, for instance, Fresh Cream, and wouldn't take the credit. He takes over and does what needs to be done, but never ever tried to, to take credit for himself. And consequently, the points, it took him forever to finally go, wait a minute, I'm getting ready for retirement. I should have had points on the Leonard Skinner album, and
Yeah, wow, what a trip.
All that kind of stuff.
What about Elliot Scheiner? You got any stories to share about him?
Elliot is just one of my all-time heroes. That man, when you watch engineers work, especially in a live situation, it's amazing. And most of them are frenetic and frantic and just moving as fast as they can, trying to dial all this shit in and get it all done in the speed of a live show. And we've done so much stuff with Els over the years, but the thing about him and a very select few engineers is it doesn't look like they're working.
Right.
He comes in and, and presets all kinds of stuff on the console because he knows what he wants, especially when we had the Neve VR. And the band comes on and starts playing, and it's a mix because he's already set that thing up, and he's just so smooth, and everything's just, oh man, just unbelievable engineer. And of course, a mixer.
What were for those listening who don't know a lot about Elliot? What were some of the records that we know that you were excited about that Elliot was doing?
Well, a lot of the Eagles stuff. We ended up doing a lot of Eagles shows, and again, one of his many talents.
And was that around the time of Hotel California?
It's for us, it wasn't until Hell Freezes Over.
Okay.
When they all because they all melted down.
Oh, that's right.
But Elliot was had worked with him way back when, and as well as all the Steely Dan stuff, and. What was I going to say? Another of his many talents is he could make those guys work without the dog fights, which they were famous for. And I've seen some of that up close. I don't want to be anywhere near it, when those two guys are in the truck. But Elliot just, had that perfectly calm demeanor and an acid sense of humor. He's just hysterical with deadpan delivery. And he could manage all that shit. And again, the music just kind of flows out of him through the console and up to the speakers.
That's great, man. So cool. Another thing I remember experiencing was watching a DVD series, like retrospective of Saturday Night Live music. And it really showed you, and I don't know that these were things that you were doing necessarily, but it just showed music, live recordings to television happening through the 70s and through the 80s. And it was really audible to me, a real shift in sound and stuff like that. And I wonder if you want to talk about, I feel like you did touch on it because you talked about Bruce Springsteen insisting on bringing a certain truck in to record. But maybe you can just talk about how recording and the sonics of audio shifted through the 70s and 80s and into 90s?
Well, again, I'm a specialist in live recording. I really didn't spend much time in the studio watching a lot of that. And I'm also very much a minimalist. I had a lot of compressors and limiters and EQs and stuff, at my my fingertips to use. But I always tried to, those were last resorts, unless you knew you were going to need a compressor on somebody, don't do it, and I'm still that way.
Right. Whereas in the studio, using a compressor is part of like sculpting a whole new kind of sound for something.
Yeah. And there's a little Elliot thing too. There was a band called Stuff in New York, and it was the AAA session players. It was Steve Gadd and two drummers, Cornell Dupree and Eric Gale on guitars, Richard T on piano. Just the cream of the studio crop. And they formed this band that used to play a lot at a club called McKell's. For your guys, if it's out there, if you look up Stuff live in New York, it's some of the funkiest instrumental shit you're ever going to hear. And I recorded that live album, engineered it, but Elliot mixed it. And I get this call. Actually, it was a long time later. And again, Elliot in his demure face kind of tells me in a low voice. He says, I had to mix that Stuff album, and there's a point in there where one of Steve's, he had double kicks. He says, well, one of the kick drum channels keeps coming in and going, and we had a fuck of a time doing it. Thank you very much. I never even heard it because, you got two drummers, and did Mike have two? All this shit is flying around.
Right, so fast.
I never got it, but the reason that it went away is because the producer, and I can't remember even who was producing it, wanted Pultecs on the kick drums and a lot of this stuff. And I not never, but I was always loath to take any tube equipment out on live shows because of that, because the tubes rattle and the cold solder joints, because the fucking thing's 30 years old. So I would never do it, but they insisted on it. We want to have that done by the time we go to. So there it was. And from that point on, I stood my ground. And I can still remember doing a Crosby, Stills and Nash live album where, again, their guys comes in. I'm actually at the console, and they're bringing in a ton of this outboard shit. And I'm saying, you can do that back home.
Right.
You ain't going to do it here.
Yeah.
You just got to stand your ground. You start plugging all that shit in on a live remote, you're just asking for trouble.
Well, I have a little bit of a story to share myself. So I was co-producing and engineering a band. And then they got a chance to be on a television show. And we went out, it was the Conan O'Brien show.
Yeah.
And we went out and they said, we want you to come on out and help us do the show. And I was like, great, cool, man. I get to fly to New York and go do this. And we show up, and they were very particular about everything, studio sound, everything. And so they had been, for this particular song in the studio, we had a 57 for a vocal mic, and it was going through a 1073, which was really gained way up and tons of compression and stuff. They're like, got to have that sound for the vocals. And I was like, okay, cool. I'll help make sure you do it. And we get there, and that was the time in a TV studio where I touched something. They're like, no, you can't move that from here to here. And, but we went in and pretty much, like you just described, we just got too much in the hair of the TV engineer who was mixing these every day, for the show. He knew what he was doing. Yeah. He knew how to get the right sound. But we insisted that we did this, and we had his vocal mic coming off stage back to the control room, all gained up through this whole thing, going back out to him in the PA. And sure enough, as you can imagine, if you gain the shit out of a lead vocal mic on stage, and the drummer was insistent that they not put up the plexiglass barriers around the drums. So that vocal mic just became a drum room mic and everything on the stage. And we did it, and they did their show, but it was such a bummer for us later. We watched the thing on TV, and then we were like, why does it sound like shit? What do we do? So, but stuff like that, you got to learn all those things. Stuff like that, you just got to learn all those things by going through the mistakes sometimes. And I guess, if you get your one shot at a TV show, maybe don't mess with it. But if you're doing them all the time, then at least you can like chalk that one up to a learning experience.
Yeah, I actually worked Saturday Night Live for a while, but doing the production mix.
Okay.
Which is way worse than doing music because you got all these RFs and body mics and all kinds of.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that too. I'm not a big sports fan, but when I do watch big, NFL television production, I'm really just amazed at the audio that we just take for granted with that stuff. Did you ever get involved in that kind of mega audio production as well for sporting events?
No, frankly, the only sport I was ever interested in was sports cars. I'm just not I was growing up as a kid. I was always the the rebel, and I don't join any club that would have me, kind of thing. So no, just the halftime kind of stuff.
Yeah,
that was it.
Well, all right. So here, let me ask one more question. This one is just sort of like, did you ever have a moment where the artist or the audience gave you feedback after a live recording that just sort of made you realize you were doing a real service to the world? Do you have any stories around that? Something where you felt like it really like clicked for you and like, wow, that really feels good. Or was that just all the time?
Well, there certainly have been those moments where it really is satisfying, to hear somebody that really liked, a particular work or particular live show. I can't think of one offhand.
Did you often have a chance to interact with the artists as well? Or was it sort of like in passing, you're out in the truck, they're coming and going from the stage and it's just like a handshake maybe somewhere, or would an artist typically come back to the truck and check out what you were doing as part of the evening?
Well, that kind of harkens back to the philosophy of it too. We're there on the mission, and my mission is not to go meet the rock star. If the rock star is interested in what we're doing and wants to hear something, absolutely. Again, we're there to keep them all going. But I never, deliberately went to do that. But the ones that are concerned, Frank Zappa would come in.
Right. He cared about all those details.
Yeah. We, over the years, especially if you've done a number of shows with him, you get to know him. Billy Joel is a hysterically funny guy and approachable, off campus, when you're not doing all that crazy stuff. So, a lot of them are great fun. If they're interested, but the last thing you want to do is go out and walk on stage to go say hi to Mick. There's a good Mick story that way. Like I say, we did all those tours, all those American tours, and periodically something would come up. And there was one show in, I don't know, Georgia, Florida, somewhere down south. And all of a sudden they've got a deal to do a live television broadcast, and there's no trucks. Our truck wasn't available, but again, the Westwood One truck was there, and they were going to do radio. But they wanted somebody that they used to, and I guess Clear Mountain wasn't available, so they called me, and I go down to do it on an unfamiliar console and all that. But because it was it was new, the manager comes in and says, Mick would like to talk to you about the show, and I go into the dressing room. Hi, how are you? And and he, Mick being. He observes everything. The man knows everything that's going on, even if he doesn't look like it. So he knew who I was and all this stuff, but he wanted to talk. And I sit down, and people were constantly coming in and out, and fashion stuff, and he would always say, excuse me, if you're deal with whatever, and then come back to maybe talking about I don't know, this song, and we're going to do that, and then here comes. The road manager with the concessions guy, right? And they're talking about the beer sales, and they're talking about where do we put Keith's songs, because that's when the audience gets up to go buy the beer. they scheduled Keith's songs. Well, I think probably at about, an hour and a half. Let's put one here,
That's
and another one
hilarious.
down
That's
there. And they knew, as Mick has famously says, advice to new stars: first, learn how to count, then learn how to sing.
Nice.
He was an economics major.
Yeah, interesting.
And they had every aspect of the tour maximized for cash.
Yeah.
And I had to really stifle a laugh.
That's funny. And then, I mean, it's just a reminder too that live performances and shows are all about that. They're all about just coordinating all these elements so that you get the maximum impact on the whole thing. I guess studio albums they have their own version of that too in the recording studio, where you're trying to arrange your song order and have a really great listening experience. You talked about Westwood One truck, and this is just a total aside, but I remember one of my favorite shows was the Dr. Demento show when I was a kid, and he was a Westwood One production. Did you ever know Dr. Demento through any of these connections, or did you do some Weird Al Yankovic recordings ever?
Well, we did work with Weird Al. He was a favorite of the MTV crowd. And we actually did MTV's first live show, and we used to do the New Year's Eve shows where they would have to play the 3 time zones, one after another,
right.
Same show, different
Wow.
time zone. And he would be on those things all the time. He was a very popular.
He's a hardworking musician.
Figure. Yeah, and the musicians love him. They love that kind of shit. That's an honor to have Weird Al do one of your songs.
Yeah, that's great. That's so cool. All right, I got one last question. We'll go into just sort of a couple of general ones on our way out. You're a dad working in music. I'm a dad working in music. What are some things, stories you might want to share or advice for the rock stars about being a parent and introducing your kids into this world? I've heard mixed opinions. Some parents are like, "Oh, I never want to do this." Some parents are all about it. What feelings do you have, or what was that experience like for you? What do you remember about that?
Well, it's a very good question for any parent, and for me, growing up military, my dad was an Air Force pilot and was in every war from two through Korea, Vietnam, all that stuff. And in that, when you grow up in that lifetime, you have a very acute sense that a lot of them don't come back. And when they do come back, the best of them will have to come back and synchronize with their family, and their wife. And in the military, it's the woman who does take all of that burden, financial, all of that stuff. And fortunately, my father was a real gentleman, and how he did it. And I look back in retrospect and think about him flying a C-130 Herc back from Vietnam and then walking back into the door of a family with 4 kids who were all in their teenage years and raising hell and creating problems. So he was always an inspiration to me. And my kids had kind of a tough time because I was always gone, but I always tried to get back. Mm-hmm. And as per our earlier conversation about the parties and that sort of thing, I usually did not partake in that stuff. And I
so
always
you come
tried
back
to
in good shape.
Adjust, when you're flying back, you start thinking about, what's going to be like, what are my responsibilities when I hit the ground, and all of that sort of thing. And thankfully, through many a near miss, all 3 of my kids have successfully become thriving adults with mates and houses, and Bank of Dad is closed. And it all worked, but it does take an enormous amount of love and concentration, because it's so easy, to come back and be in a shitty mood because something blew up and
right.
It was you've been up for 3 days and all that.
You've
stuff.
been dealing with problems for days, but it doesn't mean that your family needs to hear about it.
Exactly. It's not their problem. They didn't choose you in your profession, and so it's a lot of hard work, and it's so worth it. I look back and see three good people on the earth is the only thing that I truly did that was worthwhile.
You know, I always say that my daughter's the best record I ever made.
There you go. Yep.
What about Ryan has been on the show as well, and he is doing very well making records. You know, he's really embraced this world of audio and music making. Do you have any memories about that, or any suggestions of, you brought him on the road with you at some point. You know, you involved him in the process of recording music. Any memories around that and integrating your kids into this world and in such a way that maybe it doesn't just completely and utterly turn them off to making music?
Good question, and I've seen this play out with many very successful people in this business, and I unfortunately I got to say, more often than not, it doesn't work for your kids to go into this business again. Everybody needs to find their own place in life, and often, like happens to the rock stars and the movie stars, it happens to us too. You know, they're trying to live up to maybe a legendary figure and have to deal with all that stuff. And I don't encourage it, even though I started taking Ryan out on the road when he was 12, and it was more for him to learn the world and see the world and do all that stuff, as opposed to go in the business. I always told him this, the remote business, and I could see that coming. It's basically a dead end. It's a highly specialized, one-trick pony kind of business, unless you expand into areas where I personally did not want to go. So I always told him, you need, the deal with all three of the kids was you get your education and you can do whatever the hell you want. And that was true.
That's what he said too. He said, he talked about, my dad insisted that it felt like I should follow through with my college and get my degree.
Absolutely. Well, it's more important about learning how to learn is what college is supposed to teach you.
Yeah.
But in his case, he got an EE, electrical engineering. So that was another big plus, even though he never followed in that direction, but he knows how to deal with all that shit, with solid state and tubes. And he was a drummer, and he slowly had all these things, fall into place, so that once he graduated, I felt, well, still want to do it, but you're not going to take over the remote business, because that's not going to take you where you want to go.
Yeah.
And we got him a gig at Sony, where he started working with Elliot Scheiner and Phil Ramone and all these guys.
So cool.
And you've heard his story. I'm so proud of him. I can't begin to tell you.
I've had some other family, generational audio folks in here, like Kyle Lenning and his son Jason and Justin. And it's just always a pleasure to me to see that kind of, generations of I don't know, just moving into this kind of world. And I for me, I had to be sort of a black sheep to go this direction.
Yeah.
And I don't know what direction my daughter is going to go in, but I know she's incredibly creative. And if she chooses to go in a creative direction, I also hope that she severely kicks my ass at what she does.
Right.
And I also hope that she has an advantage because this stuff seems normal to her instead of having to go discover it out of nothing,
That's a big thing, familiarity, and it really helps out.
Well, so David, I'm going to jump forward to sort of our closing question, but this is hypothetical. We'll take the Wayback Studio machine or the Wayback remote studio machine, and you're going to go back and find young David who's racing cars, just getting ready to hit the studio, and give yourself one bit of advice, and you say, here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the recording studio or a remote recording truck yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself?
Well, the thing immediately comes to mind, going back to Frank Zappa, and as you know, he passed away due to colon cancer, I believe it was. And he was asked in one of those later interviews, what advice do you have for the up-and-coming rock star musician? And he snapped immediately, and he said, yeah, get a second opinion. And of course, he's referring to his doctor that said, oh, yeah, you're fine. until the cancer was so advanced that they couldn't do anything about it. So always look for that second opinion. When you're young and impetuous, you can sometimes jump into areas where you maybe ought not to. But again, I guess if there's any advice, if you feel like you really have that, that decision point in your life, and for me it was like a complete 180-degree swing to go from race cars and
because you didn't talk about a history of love of music. You talked really about a history of love of being on a mission.
Well,
in a way, if I'm interpreting that right.
That's true. But the swing point to me, as often happens in this business, it was a woman.
Yeah.
And it just, as I became close to her, I picked up a guitar again and tried my damnedest to be in her band. She was writing a lot of great music. And, every time I looked down at the meter, the talent meter, it just sat there on 0. So, I learned how to punch a record button.
That's awesome.
And the relationship didn't last then, but it gave me entree into the studio business, and away I went. So following that dream for me, it worked.
Yeah.
I was in the right place at the right time, like so many of us. There were no schools then. Just indentured servitude.
Well, we still got that, right?
Yeah.
Interning is such a cool experience. I absolutely love doing it myself. And I've been really honored to have great interns coming through the studio of all different personalities, all different skill levels, all that. It's just great to be interacting with people who are just kind of beginning this whole journey too. So David, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. A real honor and a pleasure to have you here in the studio and get to know you. And thank you for taking so much time out to sit with me and just sit with the rock stars and talk about your history and all this teaching. Let the rock stars know how they can find you online if they want to learn more about you. Is there anywhere they should go to? Do you have a website or anything like that you want them to know about, or should they just go find these great videos on YouTube?
Yeah, no, as advertised, I'm retired at this point. I'm an old analog curmudgeon. I don't have a website. The company did years and years ago, but that's gone. So, you can find, if you look at that credit list that you're putting up and go look for the live stuff online, you'll see a lot of that kind of thing. All
right, cool. And a reminder, rock stars, I will include the YouTube playlist and other info in the show notes. So just click through on your mobile device or go to rsrockstars.com and then use the magnifying glass, search for David Hewitt, take you right to the blog post, and there it is. Thanks for listening. Thank you, David.
My pleasure. Thanks.
All right, man. We'll see you around the studio, dude. Cheers.
All right.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.